Good morning, everyone. I'm Angela Evans, and I'm the Dean of the LBJ School. And on behalf of the community, the LBJ community, which is our faculty, our students, our wonderful alum, the great staff that's here, we want to welcome all of you to this important conference and the beginning of what I hope to be a continuing dialogue that the school sponsors. So let me just tell you a little bit about the center. And this is an important center for the LBJ School. Our inaugural director, Peniel Joseph, who is responsible for putting together this workshop and inviting folks and bringing us to this really important place in the history of our dialogue about race and democracy. Peniel, he is the inaugural director of our center. It's here at the LBJ School, and part of our sponsorship as well is with the history department of the University of Texas. So I think instead of just talking like you normally talk about, what a center is supposed to do and what this workshop is supposed to do, let me talk to you a little bit about our vision. Because, as I said, this I don't see as a one-off event of a day and a half where people come together and talk and then they go off and do their things, and we don't stay together, we don't stay as a community, we don't stay as a network, and we don't continue the dialogue. We don't think about ways that we can take what we've learned over the next day and a half and try to integrate it into what we're doing and what role we are, whether we're executing policy, whether we're deliberating policy, whether we're fighting policy, whatever it is. So I'm so pleased that we have this opportunity at the LBJ School to bring together a community of people who are going to start talking and thinking about things and learning about things from very different perspectives and from very different generations, where we have the generation that was through it all and the up-and-coming generations and scholars who are looking at that and keeping that in perspective, but looking forward in terms of the kinds of difficulties, the kinds of challenges, the kinds of opportunities we have as a community, as a citizenry, as a country, to make progress and to continue to make progress. So with that, I want to welcome you very much to the LBJ School, and I want to introduce Peniel Joseph. And Dr. Joseph came to us in the fall, and he's our inaugural director, and he just has this energy level that when he walks into a room, it's just like, if the room is quiet, it becomes very chaotic by the time he walks in. But what I like about Peniel is that he is well-grounded. He's grounded in research. He's grounded in knowledge. He's well-respected. He comes to us from Tufts. But the other thing is he's reached out already. He's not someone who's going to stay in this school and in these four walls and be satisfied. He's going to go out and he's going to force us as a school and a community to get involved, to get engaged, and to be more inclusive and more inviting. So we're very pleased to have Peniel here. We're looking forward to many more of these types of discussions or other types of discussions that you see would be useful. And so I hope you have a wonderful day and a half, and I'm going to get out of the way and turn it over to Peniel.
Okay, thank you, Dean Evans. I'm so happy to be here this afternoon. So Dean Evans talked about energy, so I want us to have some energy in here. Let's give a hand to the LBJ School and the new Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. This is a big deal to have at UT at this specific time in history. I'm very proud to be here and to have been able to really assemble a stellar lineup, including a keynote by a civil rights icon, Charlayne Hunter Gault, who I'll talk about soon. I want to talk about the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy and what we're going to try to do, and a little bit about my background. My name is Peniel Joseph, and I'm from New York City. I'm the proud son of Haitian immigrants who came to the United States in 1965. I was on my first picket line in elementary school. My mother, who's 76 years old, Jermaine Joseph, and who I owe everything to, was a hospital worker. She was part of SCIU 1199, which I later found out was Martin Luther King Jr.'s union, which was Stokely Carmichael's union, which was Fannie Lou Hamer's union, which was Ella Baker's union, which was Malcolm X's union. It has a rich history of social and political activism. We titled this conference Race, Democracy, and Public Policy, from LBJ's Great Society to Barack Obama and Black Lives Matter. We live in an extraordinary moment in American and world history. Over the last 24 months, we've seen social and political protests and upheavals domestically that are concentrated on anti-racism, concentrated on ending mass incarceration, concentrated on ending state-sanctioned violence to a degree and with a dynamism that we haven't seen in the United States since the late 1960s and early 1970s. We are in an extraordinary moment in American history, one that connects race, public policy, democratic institutions, and social and political activism. And when we think about race, criminal justice system, these are gateways to multi-level systems that structure all of our lives. Systems connected to poverty, connected to gender, connected to sexuality, connected to immigration, connected to African Americans, Latinos, whites, Asian Americans, Native Americans. It's connected to citizenship and human beings, and how do we define that in our own time? And I think what's so extraordinary is the energy that we've seen around saying that Black Lives Matter, and saying that when we articulate that Black Lives Matter, we're talking about something that's universal and not just specific. We're saying something that's transcendent. Lyndon Johnson understood, so did Fannie Lou Hamer, so did Martin Luther King Jr. When they were fighting for voting rights and they were fighting for civil rights and they were trying to desegregate American democratic institutions, they realized that Black Lives Matter. And that saying that was not trying to disparage any other group. It was trying to find the universal in the specific, and that's what our democratic creed has always been about. So a public policy school that doesn't talk about race is not a public policy school. Race is at the core of our story. It's at the core of our narrative. We would not be here today if we didn't have people who struggled to transform American democracy and bleed for American democracy. People like Charlayne Hunter Gault, people like C.T. Vivian, people like Ella Baker, people like Rosa Parks, who was an activist and not a little old lady. She was 41 years old when she refused to be segregated in Montgomery, Alabama in December of 1955. So we are in an extraordinary moment. And I think that what we're trying to do with this center is make the University of Texas at Austin and the LBJ School of Public Policy a headquarters to talk about civil rights, race, and democracy in the 21st century. And this is a good thing. This is an American thing. This is an intellectual thing. This is not something that should be marginalized. It's at the core of who we are as American citizens. Is everybody still with me? Is everybody still with me? All right. So this is the start of something that I hope will be expansive, that will be energetic, that will involve the community both in Austin, at the LBJ School, all across UT's many different campuses, that will involve our graduate students, our faculty, our staff. I'm very, very hopeful right now. We have many, many problems, including policy problems in the United States that are connected to poverty, that are connected to racial segregation, that are connected to mass incarceration. But we also have many young people, many more mature activists, many different groups of people who are trying to combine all of their energies to once again have a transformative moment in American history, a transformative movement in American history, and that is connected to political institutions, it's connected to higher education, it's connected to policy, it's connected to who we are and what we're doing right now. I want to introduce Charlayne Hunter Gault, our keynote speaker. And when I thought about organizing this conference, I couldn't think of really anybody else who would be more significant and important to provide a keynote and an opening statement for what we're trying to do here with the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy and at the LBJ School of Public Policy and at the University of Texas, Austin. Charlayne Hunter Gault is nothing less than a civil rights icon. She is an award-winning journalist. I'm going to read a little bit, and then I'm going to extemporize and then give her the mic. A civil rights pioneer and award-winning journalist with more than 40 years in the industry, Charlayne Hunter Gault has received 2 Emmy Awards and 2 Peabody Awards, among other coveted honors in journalism. She came to national attention in 1961 when she and Hamilton Holmes were the first black students to desegregate the University of Georgia amid turmoil and violence in her state. Soon after earning her degree in journalism, Hunter Gault became the first African-American reporter for The New Yorker. She was also the first female Harlem bureau chief for The New York Times. In 1978, Hunter Gault joined the PBS McNeil and Lehrer NewsHour as a national correspondent. She went on to serve as the Johannesburg bureau chief for CNN, as well as its chief correspondent in Africa before becoming a special correspondent for National Public Radio. She is currently appearing on the PBS NewsHour as a special correspondent, leading a year-long conversation on race, diversity, and intolerance. The series, Race Matters, flows out of Hunter Gault's travels speaking with experts on race with initial support from the Ford Foundation. She continues to write for publications, including The New Yorker and The Root, and she has contributed to many others, including Essence, O Magazine, the New York Times Magazine, and the New York Times Book Review. As well, she has co-authored several books, including 2012's To the Mountaintop, My Journey Through the Civil Rights Movement, and an e-book called Corrective Rape, about the practice of some South African men raping gay women to change their sexual orientation. Hunter Gault holds more than 36 honorary degrees and other distinctions, including the Du Bois Medal from Harvard University, the Washington Press Club Foundation's 2015 Lifetime Achievement Award, and induction into the Atlanta Press Club Hall of Fame. And she's active on Twitter. Her Twitter handle is @CharlayneHG. But really, she's so much more. She's one of the civil rights activists and icons who continue to fight the good fight. Continues to be a trailblazer, continues to be a groundbreaking journalist and speaker, and somebody who mentors a whole younger generation of young people of color who are trying to break into the business as well. But more than that, she really continues to be somebody who is a political activist, a feminist, an outspoken critic of injustice and social inequality everywhere and anywhere it can be. And in that, she gives us an example that when we think about the civil rights movement, it's not a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It is something that continues. And Charlayne Hunter Gault is a great example of continuing the struggle even after major legislation was passed. This is after the Voting Rights Act. This is after the Open Housing Act of 1968. And in that, she really sits alongside great civil rights icons of our time, including Barbara Jordan, who has a special relationship with Texas and with the LBJ School, of course, and who became the first black African-American to deliver a keynote at the Democratic National Convention in 1976, that very, very famous keynote. Barbara Jordan's legacy is one of continuing the struggle long after the marches and demonstrations were receiving national attention. And I think Charlayne Hunter Gault's contribution has been continuing the struggle long after the marches and the demonstrations received national attention. Ironically, in 2016, we have her delivering a keynote at a key juncture in history when these marches and these demonstrations are receiving national attention once again. So we're seeing and hearing echoes of the 1960s and 70s in extraordinary ways for all of us. And so what I hope to do is for us to use the talent and use the skills and the research and the resources that we have right here at the LBJ School to address these challenges in a very, very sober way, in a way that's research-bound, but in a way that is transformative, and that is focused on solutions, but is also focused on sharing this conversation with the public. We're a public policy school, but we're also doing public history and public engagement so that we may have impact on the real world. We don't want to do research that we hide and we save just for ourselves and our students, and we tell people that we've got these big, thick books that you can't read, and it's ours. We want to share and engage with people, and that's what the civil rights movement always has been. It's always been about this kind of engagement and this public conversation. Dr. King was a public intellectual. Ella Baker was a public intellectual. Fannie Lou Hamer was a public intellectual, sharing what was happening all around the world with a wider public who couldn't go to Alabama, who couldn't be in Texas, who couldn't be in Mississippi, right? They shared that, and I hope that we can have that conversation together, and it really starts now. So, Charlayne Hunter Gault.
Thank you so much, Peniel. And greetings to all of you. I want to hasten to say that I am both honored and a little bit intimidated to be the opening speaker before an audience as august as this one, not least the historians like the one among you who invited me here to speak today and who just gave my speech. But that's us, because I was telling him this morning that I hope you don't mind, I've cribbed a lot from what you've written for my talk today, and he said, that's okay, I've cribbed a lot from what you've written, so I could understand how we are both on the same page. And most recently, I cribbed from, on another talk, I cribbed from Peniel his commentary about a certain presidential candidate and a certain Supreme Court justice. And if you have any concerns or interest in what that is, you can just go look it up. And it was in the Times, right? Right. Also, the fact that Peniel can take positions that I as a journalist cannot or should not, but that I can forward to my friends that may have missed them simply saying FYI. So I want to welcome all of you, and especially my former Peabody Board members, with whom I've had a wonderful several years of experience judging some of the best work in and outside of this country. Now today, I'm not going to cross the line, I hope. Depends on how spirited I get, but I'm going to try not to cross the line of a journalist. But I do want to speak not only from Peniel's commentaries that I have cribbed, but from my own experiences and observations as both a participant and an observer of our ongoing quest for a more perfect union. Now today, I hope to be able to speak to dreams realized and dreams deferred. But in the process, I want to return you to history and ask, what do we learn from history? And to put forward a contradiction offered by one of my University of Georgia professors in the Henry W. Grady School of Journalism, who used to say, we learn from history that we do not learn from history. And so I began with one of the things that was the staple of my childhood and my youth. It came from James Weldon Johnson, who wrote it in celebration. We've had a wonderful discussion with one of your panelists today about the Black Republicans and the party. This was in celebration of Abraham Lincoln's birthday in the 1800s. And it goes like this: sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. And then it goes on to say, facing the rising sun of a new day begun, let us march on. Finish it, Peniel. You got it. Let us march on till victory is won. Now, some years later, another staple of my youth, Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black History Week that we celebrated, but we celebrated, somebody's here, one of our panelists from Atlanta, and he's too young to remember, but back in the days of segregation, every day was Black History Day. Because when I walked into Henry McNeil Turner High School, I had to know who Henry McNeil Turner was. But I didn't mind having it a week. I didn't mind having it a month. Today, I'd like to have it every day, but anyway, that's another story. So I come here today as a child of the Carter G. Woodson Black History Week, who at that time wrote that learning history can transform lives. Now, I come today also wearing more than sister locks. Some of you know what that is. I come wearing a coat of many colors, not the one I had planned to wear, but anyway, that's another story too. I also come as a child of the AME Church and a family of preachers and saints. My grandfather was the presiding elder of the AME Church, but my grandmother was the saint. And in each of those situations, I was taught values that my own experiences have confirmed are timeless and transcendent. Values that enabled me to fulfill my dreams despite the obstacles put in my path at the beginning of a journey. And values that enabled me in the fullness of time to give voice to others whose dreams were yet to be fulfilled. So my journey today with you is to explore dreams fulfilled and dreams deferred, and to look at the role that history has played in my life as well as in the larger community, and ask which is the truer statement. Do we learn from history, or do we learn from history that we do not learn from history? Again, child of the Civil Rights Movement, journalist who stands on the shoulders of giants, and who began my own journey as both a participant and an observer. And I am informed as a journalist often by my own experiences, as when I covered apartheid in South Africa, that country's Jim Crow. And I just saw in the paper the other day somebody calling where we are today in America apartheid, but anyway, that's also another story. But if you will indulge me for a moment, as my father used to say in the pulpit, more about me. In a few weeks' time, I'm going to celebrate my 74th birthday with a surprise party given by my husband. I'm secretly working on it. I'm surprising him because I'm organizing it. But this is the honest truth. For many of those 74 years, around the time of my birthday, I began to experience coincidences, or as my daughter, the spirit-filled artist, would say, synchronicity. Although you could say also that with age brings greater clarity, whichever way you want to put it. Anyway, this January has been no exception. And these coincidences provide good examples to me of the importance to me of learning from history. So in an effort to be true to my craft of more than 50 years, I pondered this question: how much can we learn from history that can be applied to the challenges that Peniel referred to a few moments ago? So back to synchronicity. A few days ago, I was turning over in my mind what I might offer you today. And as I said, a little bit intimidated, all these historians in the room and smart people, you know. But I was working on this series that I'm doing that Peniel alluded to. It's called Race Matters Solutions for the PBS NewsHour, and it took me to Montgomery, Alabama. And lo and behold, as I left the Southern Poverty Law Center, where I was conducting interviews relating to police violence, school segregation, resegregation, white hate groups, and others, I was totally surprised to see right in front of me, as we drove around the corner, the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, which is now known as the Dexter Avenue King Memorial Baptist Church. And so I quickly got out of the car. I don't know why I didn't realize it was there. I didn't learn from history, obviously, but I was learning at the moment. So I got out and I ran up the stairs and I read the black and gold plaque, which described Dr. King's pastorate of the church from 1954 to 1965, and his return in December 1955 to help organize the bus boycott following Rosa Parks' decision to sit down and stand up for freedom for all. Now, in front of the church were two things: a replica of the bus Ms. Parks took, which was there to take a group on a tour of the church, and it was filled with pictures dating back to that monumental moment in 1955. And the black driver was a woman with hair the color of mine, and she invited me into the bus, and she proudly pointed out the exact seat where Rosa Parks sat. I got off of the bus after a few moments of teariness. I cry at a bad commercial, but anyway, this was legitimate tears. But in front of the bus was a white cement lining across the crosswalk, and it was filled with images of the footsteps representing 25,000 people Dr. King addressed that day, many of whom had survived Bloody Sunday in Selma. Now, some of you are old enough to remember it when it was happening, and some of you saw it recently in the much-discussed movie Selma. But although I had written about that history, it came flooding back as I remembered what Dr. King told the demonstrators that day before they embarked on the 54-mile, 5-day trek to Montgomery. And in case you don't remember, it was a trek that was sparked by the killing of a black man by the name of Jimmy Lee Jackson by a state trooper as he tried to protect his mother from attacks on what had been demonstrations for voting rights in Marion, Alabama. And the other reason for the march was to call on the all-white lawmakers to grant African Americans their constitutional right to vote. And it was after Bloody Sunday and before the beginning of that dangerous but determined journey that Dr. King spoke these words. He said, "Somebody's asking, how long will justice be crucified and truth buried? I come to say to you this afternoon, however difficult the moment, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long, because truth crushed to earth will rise again." How long? Not long, because no lie can live forever. And since I always carry my own book to the mountaintop, that's to the mountaintop, along with my cosmetics, I whipped out the page and turned to this paragraph. How long? Not long, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. See, I knew I was in a crowd that knew things. That's why I'm so intimidated up here. As I walked away from the church, though, I glanced at the glass enclosure that held the name of the minister today and was struck by the title of his sermon, given where we are and where that arc is bending today. And the title of his sermon, this was like about 3 weeks ago, was Trusting God for Victory. Those words assaulting my consciousness as my feet landed on that white cement crosswalk. But this time, the child of the civil rights movement collided with the journalist I am, and once again, tears welled up in my eyes as I looked across the street at the piece of marble commemorating the end of the march, not least because I wondered about the role of such history and the dreams realized and the dreams deferred. Now, back to synchronicity. Now, I know I got some doubting Thomases and Thomasinas in here on this synchronicity thing, but stay with me, okay? After I returned home and began thinking about this challenging assignment today, my computer burped. Do your computers burp? Mine does. It goes burp. And there was a note from a friend that included a recently discovered tape that contained a speech by Dr. King, and it was found in the storage closet at Amherst College, the storage closet of the student radio station, just a few weeks ago. And I almost fainted because it was just about what I was trying to write from memory. And in that, it illustrated what today confirms Dr. King's prescience. For it was just 1 year after the Supreme Court's 1954 decision outlawing segregation that saw woefully unequal resources allotted to black schools and ordering integration to proceed with all deliberate speed. But a year later, there had been no speed. That was 1955. And so Dr. King addressed it that day in Montgomery, saying the phrase all deliberate speed did not mean that another century should be allowed to unfold before we release Negro children from the narrow pigeonhole of segregated schools. In 1961, 7 years after all deliberate speed, and an almost 2-year legal battle, I walked onto the campus of the University of Georgia with my high school classmate, Hamilton Holmes, entering, as you heard Peniel say, as one of its first 2 black students. To say our entry was tumultuous is an understatement. To say that we were greeted with violence of the verbal kind is putting it nicely. But we celebrated our victory by ignoring all of that, and also by the fact that the federal judge who ordered us in ordered all schools in the state starting the following fall from the university level on down to desegregate. And for a while there was some effort to comply with the law. And yet one could argue, and I think effectively, that Dr. King's words are as relevant today as then, as our schools are more segregated than they were in the 60s. And 80% of the teachers in all of our schools are white, which is not to say they are not good teachers, but our young people of color, like our movie audiences, are not seeing people who look like them. Far too many of all of our teachers today, also white as well as black, do not know, nor do they teach the history of the civil rights movement beyond Dr. King and maybe Rosa Parks, or have a clue about the giants on whose shoulders they stood. Barack Obama acknowledged that he stood, or those who marched and protested with him. So the question becomes, what can and do they offer those who are confronting today's challenges? Can they learn anything from history so that their dreams will be realized and not once again deferred? Now, I know there's still some of you out there doubting my synchronicity, but check this out. A few days before I went to Montgomery, I sat in the Oslo Theater in Sarasota, Florida, as a talented group of actors performed the award-winning play All the Way, the dramatization of President Johnson's shrewd, that's one way to put it, laborious, and ultimately successful effort to pass the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964. Dr. King's words at that time were recited by one of the people in the play. The Negro, he said, also has to recognize that 100 years after emancipation, he lived on a lonely island of economic insecurity. This is Martin Luther King back in the 50s. Economic security in the midst of material prosperity. In the past 2 decades, Dr. King said, changes in our country's economic structure have obscured the fact that the Negro's median income is half that of the white man. Negroes are still at the bottom of the economic ladder. I'm not talking about today, I'm talking about 1955. They live within 2 concentric circles of segregation. One imprisons them on the basis of color, while the other confines them within a separate culture of poverty. The average Negro is born into want and deprivation. His struggle to escape his circumstances is hindered by color discrimination. He is deprived of normal education and normal social and economic opportunities. Now, this is my favorite part. All of that was good too. But then he says, when he seeks opportunity, he is so often told, in effect, to lift himself by his own bootstraps, advice which does not take into account that he is barefoot. I like that, huh? You like that? I got a little of my daddy in me. Well, we got a civil rights bill that outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. It ended unequal application of voter registration requirements and public accommodations. Now, to go back to my daddy and my granddaddy, if they were in the pulpit right now, and I had just said that, my grandfather would say, well, how long? Well, our civil rights protests, that bill led to dreams realized. Today, boardrooms and living rooms are filled with African Americans who fall comfortably into the category of the upper middle class. Not long ago, I attended an event honoring my lawyer, Vernon Jordan, who helped win our case against the state of Georgia. He was a young civil rights lawyer making $35 a week. Now, y'all know who Vernon Jordan is today, so that's pretty inconceivable, right, that he was making $35 a week? Dreams deferred, but dream. So, at that time, he was just out of law school, as I said, making $35 a week, and today, he is one of the most successful African Americans, but I would also say one of the most successful men of any race, who was feted that night with people he helped reach the mountaintop. People like the CEOs like Ursula Burns, the head of Xerox, Ken Chenault, the head of American Express. Moreover, the audience was filled with others like them. Today also, my TIA CREF funds, I'm old enough now to be getting a few of them, are in a big tent headed by Roger Ferguson, a black man, as well as brilliant black academics like those who are going to be on these panels today. Skip Gates, godfather to Peniel's very proud daughter. Khalil Gibran Muhammad, who is leaving the Schomburg after a stellar tenure to go to Harvard, where he also joins people like Charles Ogletree and Evelyn Hickenbotham, who is also president of the Association for African American Life and History. So she believes there's something about history that's useful. And I could go on naming others, like some of you, again, who will be sharing your brilliance over the next 2 days. But again, how many dreams deferred? When I look at America's total landscape today, I'm reminded of a quote. Did you ever quib this one, Peniel? A quote I used in the New York Times in the late 70s about black youth unemployment. And the quote was, now this is the late 70s, the quote was about black teenage unemployment, and it was, "They are piling up at the bottom." A phrase that if I were writing for the New York Times today, but you could do this, Peniel, if you want to use it. Black unemployment overall remains twice as high as whites. And the average white family has 13 times the wealth of the average black family. That's according to the CNN Kaiser Family Foundation. Once unemployed, it takes blacks 5 weeks longer to land a job than whites. More than 1 in 4 black Americans are in poverty, and nearly that many Hispanics are. Just under 11% of white children were in poverty, say, in 2013, but 38% of black children and 30% of Hispanic children are poor. Moreover, according to that survey, more than half of Asian adults over 25 have a bachelor's degree, compared to 33% of whites, 19% of blacks, and 14% of Hispanics. So let's not even go to the disparity in incarceration rates or the deaths of the Jimmy Lee Jacksons of today. I mean, look at Iowa, big time in the news recently, but guess what? African Americans count for 3% of the population in Iowa, but 25% of those in jail. So my question is, do we learn from history? And if so, what have we learned from history? Let me turn briefly to my history and my values that I also think provided the armor worn by the people Peniel talked about. Fannie Lou Hamer, the lawyers and the preachers, as well as SNCC, the shock troops of the movement, and the foot soldiers, and the high school students like Brenda Travis, all of whom made up our civil rights movement. But when I speak at schools today, from lower grades all the way up to college and graduate schools, and I ask, how many of you have ever heard of Martin Luther King? Whew, all the hands go up. How many of you ever heard of Rosa Parks? All the hands go up. How many of you ever heard of Brenda Travis? Who? Even Diane Nash, who was one of the major organizers of the movement. No hands go up. Again, I get close to tears. The journalist in me asks, what did Brenda Travis do that was against what even the SNCC shock troops of the movement were opposed to? And what was the result? I'm not going to tell you because I'm sure all of you know. But how relevant is her history to young activists today? What is it about what Brenda Travis did that could help inform our Black Lives Matter and others today. Now, back to my history, real quick, and the history that helped me realize my dreams. In our segregated communities, neighborhoods, schools, and churches, the people of our village in Covington, Georgia, were not politically empowered because of the Jim Crow laws, but they were not daunted by the laws and the efforts to keep them in their place. The title of my first book, by the way. Rather, like James Weldon Johnson's poem I quoted earlier, they had the faith that the dark past had taught them. And even when they couldn't give us first-class citizenship, they gave us a first-class sense of ourselves. And I'll tell you a quick example based on my own experience. We got the hand-me-down textbooks from the white schools, often with pages missing. So once a year, the community of Black folks, the village, would raise money to help make up for some of these deficits. And whichever family raised the most money, the daughter or the son would be crowned king or queen. This particular night, my grandmother and my mother had been over in the corner with their little white linen handkerchiefs, counting out the nickels and quarters and stuff they had raised. And finally, they announced the queen, and it was Charlayne Hunter. Well, I got a diamond tiara and a Bulova watch. I put the diamond tiara on, and I was insufferable to my classmates for a number of days. Eventually, I took it off, but the notion that I was the queen took up residence in my head. So many years later, I'm walking onto the campus of the University of Georgia, and the students are shouting, "Nigger, go home, kill the nigger." And I'm looking around for the nigger because I know who I am. I am the queen who was crowned all those years ago. So people say, you had the courage. No, I didn't have the courage. I had my damn tiara, you know? And when I told my mother one day in this same little segregated community that I wanted to be a journalist like the comic strip character Brenda Starr, white woman, beautiful, redhead, traveling all over the world and doing great things, my mother didn't say, "Oh no, that's not something little Black girls can do around here." She said simply, because that's how my mother spoke, "If that's what you want to do." Because I think that the history of that dark past had taught my mother that dreams propel ambition. So, what do I learn from history? A first-class sense of myself that propelled me to walk alongside J.D. Salinger at the New Yorker when I was struggling to be a writer and eventually was promoted to the staff as its first Black writer. And then it was also there that I heard Dr. King. I was sitting at my desk at the New Yorker watching the March on Washington in 1963, and I heard Dr. King speak about the fierce urgency of now. Yet, at the same time, we had riots later because the fierce urgency of now had not been realized. The riots happened in cities across America, and a presidential commission called the Kerner Commission blamed the media in part for the riots because they didn't have anybody working for them who lived in those neighborhoods who could talk about the simmering discontent among people whose rights were not being realized. And this was all over the country, not just in the South. And so Bob Maynard and a bunch of us formed a group that trained 20% of the African American journalists, many of whom today are still working. But when I look at the television these days, I ask myself, often aloud, much to my husband's discontent, where are the Black journalists when the issue is not race? Where are the Black journalists when they're talking about the nuclear deal with Iran? I know about it. I got views on it. I mean, I'm not pushing myself to do it, but I know that there are those out there who can't. Or China's suffering economy, or even climate change. Moreover, as the media morphs into different forms requiring fewer boots on the ground, guess who ain't coming to dinner? Or breakfast, if that's when you read your paper. Once again, what do we learn from history? Are we going to have another Kerner Commission report? Now, I was not one of those who didn't believe that we would see a black man in the White House as president. I mean, I come from the civil rights movement, and that's part of what we were working towards. But I didn't believe that Obama's victory would necessarily and instantaneously lead us to a post-racial society. The torch may have been passed from the Moses King generation to the Obama Joshua generation, but as New York Times columnist Maureen Dowd, whom I don't often quote, but anyway, she has written, this is not being recorded, is it? I'm sorry, Maureen, I didn't mean that. But anyway, in this instance, she said something that I found extremely quotable. She said, "It's nice to talk about change, but you can't wipe away yesterday." But back to synchronicity. We're not going to get away from that today. In between computer burps, I am working away, writing down thoughts about today, when I hear Colbert announce his next guest, DeRay McKesson, or DeRay as you Northerners say. Well, no, we're in Texas, aren't we? DeRay, I say, but he says DeRay. A key leader, I don't have to tell you, of the Black Lives Movement, Campaign Zero. One of the most vocal critics, of course, of police excesses and other issues dealing with problems facing African Americans today. I first met DeRay when he served on a panel I do every year on Martha's Vineyard for Harvard's Hutchins Institute. This panel focused on young protesters like DeRay and some who disagree with him, and so it was called Black Millennials. They rock, but can they rule? And it drew comparisons to today's young militants and those from the days of the civil rights movement. And a critical issue was the similarities and differences between the protesters of today and those in the 60s. Now, during our panel, I'm sitting on the end, and I'm listening, and DeRay was making some really important points, but he spent most of his time with his head bowed. And I couldn't figure out, I thought, well, maybe he's just exhausted from the travel. I mean, he'd just been released from jail the night before for protesting, but I later learned it was because he was tweeting the whole time. Now, that phenomenon is definitely different from the activities of the civil rights movement days. The point he made on Colbert, saying that technology has enabled protesters to amplify their message and accelerate the pace of change. And that is when, coincidentally, half taking notes, let's go back to synchronicity, and half listening, I heard the point that I had just heard in the Amherst speech, where Dr. King had said, "It is an axiom of social change that no revolution can take place without a methodology suited to the circumstances of that period." And I remember him telling the marchers, Dr. King, in 1963, to go back to Mississippi, to go back to Alabama, to go back to South Carolina, go back to Georgia, Louisiana, go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can be changed. So as I read these words, and I do often, I ask, do we learn from history, or do we not learn from history, as we confront the issues we had once resolved, the dreams deferred? And to add to those I've mentioned, one of the latest, voting rights, which is once again a threat to myriad Black voices, and the issue of rights for all, including those within the LBGT community. Now, fast forward back to DeRay. So I listened to DeRay spar rather effectively with Colbert, who was playing devil's advocate, as he does so well. And I heard DeRay pay homage to Dr. King, saying that some people in the movement today misunderstand Dr. King, not realizing that he was a true revolutionary, championing some of the same things that young protesters are focused on today. And he went on to say that Black Lives Matter was an idea as much as a movement, and that it existed in many forms without a formal structure. And one of the criticisms I often hear of today's young giants is that they are highlighting the causes, but the question is, are they furthering the dream? But one could ask if they are following consciously or not the exhortation of Dr. King when he told the marchers to go back to Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, Georgia, and the northern cities and the slums, knowing that the situation can be changed. And every day now, I see increasing evidence that this younger generation of activists are learning from history, whether they acknowledge it or not, and are moving to issues like voting rights and even running for office, which we now know in terms of DeRay, for example, he's about to run for mayor of Baltimore. Now, back to DeRay and Colbert. And this is what DeRay said to Colbert when he asked, what should we be doing today? And this is what DeRay said. I heard him speaking of racism, and he said, we can't change it in America without addressing it. We got to create space for that conversation. And that is when I shouted out loud again to my husband's dismay, hallelujah! For that is what I'm currently attempting to do on the PBS NewsHour with my series Race Matters. That is, focus on solutions to the problem that remains a challenge despite victories won. And so I talked with a range of people, from the white mayor of Charleston in the wake of the church slayings, a white man who has done so much to bring African Americans into the government structures that some whites labeled him LBJ, Little Black Joe. Not the one of the Civil Rights Act, but letters meaning Little Black Joe. And from others who had solutions to problems with police and black citizens, to rescuing children in places like South Central LA from gangs, getting them on a pathway to college, to helping people get past the uncomfortable conversations about race, to how to fix segregated schools while working towards diversity and inclusive schools and solving the issue of diversity in the entertainment industry that reflects the larger society. For example, the call to boycott the Oscars is getting major attention for the dearth of diversity in the entertainment industry. But as some commentators have argued, the issue is really bigger than the Oscars. The Academy's blunder, according to A.O. Scott in the New York Times recently, one of their chief correspondents, he said it reflects the structural biases of the movie industry, which in turn reflects deeply embedded racism in the society at large. And no institution, he says, is immune. Another echoed what Darnell Hunt of UCLA told me in my Race Matters conversations, that is, what gets moguls' attention is not doing what is morally right, but the bottom line. And he and his team at UCLA have conducted a study of diversity and found that 94% of the decision makers in the industry are white and 86% are male, arguing that their bottom line is going to be affected by a population that somehow in the next 30 to 40 years will be people of color, and they will want to see people who look like them when they go to the movies, or maybe they won't go. And so he told me, when you start connecting diversity to the bottom line, to the dollars, to shareholder value, suddenly it becomes more of an imperative. Now, why do I bring what might seem like something with little relationship to some of the larger issues here today? Because when I asked Darnell about what he was trying to do in the entertainment industry, how it was going to impact the racial discourse that we now have in this country, which is really very difficult, toxic and poisonous are the same thing, aren't they? Yeah, same thing. Toxic, poisonous, all that. Well, this is what he said. Where we are right now with race is very difficult. I mean, it's a sort of period of contradictions. We have an American president, and that has created the illusion of a number of people that we're beyond race, that race doesn't matter anymore. And yet we have all these high-profile cases around the country of racial profiling, of vigilantism, and so forth and so on, rooted in race hatred. And he went on to say that race, and I think you were saying this too, Peniel, is a core reality of the American experience. Media images on television need to reflect that reality to help people who consume media and who don't have the day-to-day face contact with others, and that's a lot of people, or where that contact is minimal, to help them have a greater appreciation of other experiences and how they're all a part of the American fabric. Like many of those I've spoken with over the past year, Hunt doesn't believe that there is a silver bullet that will end racism or convert all races. But most of them agree on one point. It will take lots of interventions on lots of different fronts, including the biggest expression that can be made in a democracy, one that people of goodwill, black and white together, and that's another thing. I'm going to say this real quick, and I'm going to be through in a minute, because I know you told me not to talk too long, but I got wound up here. It bothers me when people talk about white people this and white people that, or when they talk about black people this and black people that. We're not homogenous. White people died for us. Viola Liuzzo, Goodman, Schwerner, James Reeb, so many others. We got to be more careful about our speech and how we characterize our problem. That's just a little aside I didn't have here, but I feel deeply about that. Anyway, he says that there'll never be a silver bullet that will totally end racism or convert all races. But most agree, most of those I've interviewed on solutions to race agree on one point. Lots of interventions on different forms, voting, and now Black Lives Matter have moved into that arena. They're organizing around voting rights. And whether they sing or even know that old civil rights song, ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. My history, shared with a generation that not only sang that song, but lived it, causes me to hope that a generation of tweeters and Snapchatters and Instagrammers and WhatsAppers and those whose favorite word is amazing or awesome. Anyway, I'm hoping that they will all learn from history and seek out those who sang that song, ain't gonna let nobody, and that they will form a coalition of generations, like we have here today, a coalition of generations that together will fight on till the theme that will be posted in that glass enclosure that I saw the other day at the Dexter Avenue Memorial Baptist Church in Montgomery will change from trusting God for victory to thank God Almighty, more victories won. I thank you.
And certainly students in my civil rights class should have some questions. My civil rights and public policy class, the graduate students who are here should have some questions. Please identify yourself as well.
Hello, my name is Libby, and I moved to Austin about 3.5 years ago and have learned, sadly, about the institutionalized racism in this progressive city. I heard right here on this campus a great speech by the gentleman who just died in August, whose name, Julian Bond, thank you. And when asked the question, can people be colorblind, he had a very strong response to that, and I wondered if you, what you say to that.
I knew Julian well. We grew up together in the civil rights movement, so I can imagine what he said. And Julian, if you could sort of beam down to me your answer right about now. How can you be colorblind? We all are a multivaried colors in this country. And when you deny a person's color, which identifies generally who they are, although sometimes it's hard to detect, but I mean, I just have never liked the term. I mean, there may be others who will defend it, but I don't think that's the society we want. I think it takes us on a path we don't really want to go Because yes, we're all citizens, to be sure. We're all human beings, to be sure. But we all have different backgrounds, different experiences that we want to share. And that sometimes becomes part of the difficulty of talking about race. One of the conversations we had was with a Northeastern University professor by the name of Linda Tropp. And she talked about how difficult it is, even with your white friends sometimes, to have honest conversations about race because it's often embarrassing and hard to listen to if it's a black person giving an experience that they've had. I got one I'll tell you about later. But anyway, just recently. But she said, you know, learning to talk honestly about race is sort of like learning to play tennis. When you first pick up that racket, you don't just hit an ace immediately. You have to practice it. And that's what she says about having an honest discussion about race. So if somebody white tells somebody black, well, you know, I'm colorblind, there's a way to address that without saying, what the hell are you talking about? You know? And the other thing is, I'll share this real quick because it actually doesn't really relate quite to your question, but on this issue of police brutality against blacks, my next conversation, and write this down, www.pbsnewshour.org. I want you to go and look at these interviews and respond, because I love the conversations that follow, not all of them polite or positive, but that's okay too. The next one coming along at the moment is from a guy named Kevin Murphy, who comes from Montgomery, Alabama. He was the police chief who, when they had last year's anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March, was so moved that on the spur of the moment, he handed John Lewis his badge. So he didn't get along with the mayor, so the mayor fired him. But he's now working as the deputy sheriff. And so I went to talk to him about his solutions to race. And one of the things that he did when he first took over as a police chief, he went to the police academy and he had them incorporate in their study a history of black people in America, from Dred Scott all the way to today. Because he said that part of what he thinks motivates some of the reactions that white officers have to black people is fear. And the fear is based on ignorance. And sometimes, he says, if you understand the history of black people and why sometimes you might get a pushback when you, a white officer, says something in an authoritative way to a black person whose history is in his head about white Selma to Montgomery violence, who knows? He wants these white policemen to understand and then process that as they respond to a black person. And I said, well, what about the black people who are criminals? I mean, you know, we're not all like me, good people. And he said, even then, there's a way to deal with it with respect. But he said that one of the biggest issues is fear. And so we've got to figure out, not only among our policemen, but among our citizens who are now, many of whom are now so worried that in the next 20 to 30 years, whites are going to be in the minority and blacks and people of color are going to be in the majority. How do you get past that fear? And I think one of the ways you get past it is to acknowledge sometimes the role that white people played in our liberation, but also to carefully unpack the miles we still have to go and the responsibilities that they, as well as we, have. So that's a long, I'm not going to answer the next question that long, but I just got going. Sorry. Anybody else? Yes?
Yes. I'm sorry. Well, first of all, I'm Teddy McDaniel. I'm president and CEO of the Austin Area Urban League here in Austin. So thank you for telling so much truth. Dr. Joseph, welcome. I know you're new. You struck so many chords, and Austin needs to hear this because it has a liberal and progressive label, but when you peel it back, it's not so liberal and so progressive for black people. I just need to be clear on that. My question to you, and you brought up Dr. King in his talk of economic inequalities, which we're still fighting every day, especially here in Austin, double-digit unemployment, all of that. Will your Race Matters series, or can you give some thoughts on the racial wealth gap? Because too many folks don't know it. But can you talk about that?
Right. Well, let me just say, in a preface to answering the question or trying to, you know, we all have issues about race or whatever, or many of us do. My series is not aimed at people, can I say this, bitching about race? Complaining about race, but people who have actually put programs in place to solve some of the problems. And yes, that is the case. I'm going to be looking at that. And the most recent one I did Saturday, was with a woman named Beth Ann Hardison. And this wasn't about the wealth gap that you're addressing, but it was about the lack of diversity on America's runways. And, you know, what she did to bring in more people who looked like her and Naomi Campbell and the 2 or 3 black models that they had at the time. And she has managed to diversify the runways of America, which are just a symbol. I mean, you know, I say, well, isn't this sort of a frivolous way of looking at race? But no, it's a reality. And she said something, I had finished the interview, my cameraman had packed up, and she said, you know, a lot of these designers, like a lot of my white friends, consider themselves liberal. And so when you say that they are racist, or when they say, I'm not a racist, she said, well, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people who commit racial acts. They may not be racist, and they may not even be aware, because what she told me was that when there was a period when there were black models and everything, and then there came a period when these designing houses, the top ones, began bringing in razor-thin, beautiful Asian models and others from other countries who didn't necessarily fit the body type of a lot of the African-American women. And they ruled the runways for a long time. And they didn't really even think about what impact this was having on the indigenous population here of African-Americans here in America. So sometimes what people say and do is unconscious, which not necessarily makes them a racist, but the effect of what they're doing is racist. So I made him unpack and set back up and say, could you just tell me that again? So you'll see that when that issue, when her conversation runs. Did I answer your question? Oh, but the other thing about that is this. I live in a very wonderful, 2 very wonderful places. Sarasota, Florida, and so my husband can play golf in the wintertime, and Martha's Vineyard, so my husband can play golf in the summertime. That's how we roll. And how should I put it? The social gatherings that we have are only integrated because we consciously do so. I think no matter where you are in the country today, and I travel all over this country, people still live in their little enclaves where the other people who are their neighbors look like them. And that's something that is affecting the schools. That's why you have so much. We got a brother here who's going to be speaking to you later from Atlanta. Grew up in Atlanta, went to Georgia Tech. I forgive him for that. He could have gone to UGA, but, you know, anyway, Georgia Tech's okay. I'm friends with them now. Anyway, one of the interviews I had was with a brilliant academic by the name of Pedro Noguera. I'm sure you Harvard and St. Louis and all you academics will know Pedro Noguera. You should. Because Noguera has looked at this issue of resegregation of schools. Atlanta, Georgia where I had hoped that after our desegregation of UGA and the judge's ruling would desegregate Atlanta public schools, Atlanta has some of the most segregated schools in the worst conditions in the country, which isn't to say, that Pedro points out, that every segregated school has to have failing students. And he gave me some examples. There's one in, a couple in Massachusetts where it's all black, but the students are excelling. And I said, well, how is that? He said, because the teachers are concentrating on literacy, and they are also, the school administrators are bringing in social workers and other people who can support the needs of these kids who are growing up in this situation of inequality, so that their own parents can't provide a lot. I was in Harlem 2 days ago on 125th Street. And despite the fact that Harlem is becoming increasingly gentrified, there's still a lot of black people living there and a lot of black poor people. I was appalled when I, walked up and down the street, and every other store is a fried food place. You wonder why we're having so much problems with obesity, because that's where our children are being fed. Because I watched the parents bringing their children from the schools in the neighborhood, and they stop and they buy them a bag of potato chips, and they buy at the dollar store a $1.50 pizza, which that child is going to have for dinner. Now, here you have Harlem, which is so totally unlike the Harlem I used to live in. Maya Angelou's house in the heart of Harlem is on sale for $5 million, a brownstone. I'm sorry I sold mine when I did, because it wasn't anywhere near that. So you have these, in effect, you have these two separate societies that we talked about back in the day of the Kerner Commission. One white and prosperous, and one, the white women with their small babies and their husbands and their dogs, who would not have come to Harlem when I lived there in the 60s, 70s, are now walking around free, which I think is wonderful. But one day I looked, and there was this white woman walking down the street. She looked like she might work in a bank or something, and she, professional with the dress and thing. And there was this brother on the street, either drug addict or drunk. I don't know which was which. But he was yelling at her, saying, "Get the hell out of my house, mama." And this woman, 15 years ago, A, wouldn't have been walking down that street. Mm-hmm. But B, if this brother had started on her like this one did, she would have been on the 911 in a millisecond. This woman walked on past this brother like she sees him every day. He says the same thing to her every day. She knows he's harmless. And she just keeps on walking. But that kind of inequality, living side by side with prosperity, I don't know where it's going to lead us, but it's not a good thing. And I said to a friend of mine, I said, what can we do with these young parents? How can we support them as Pedro says they're being supported in this school, because in that school that he talked about, there was they also teach them nutrition. And, it may not be what Michelle Obama's trying to feed them, but it's better than what they're getting on 125th Street. So we still have two nations, and we still have to analyze that and talk about it. And, as I said about the vineyard, the fact that our interactions with people of all races is so normal that we can have these difficult conversations and nobody's embarrassed, because they know that we all actually love one another. Mm-hmm. These are some of my best friends, the white people who come to my house and I go to their house, and we can talk about these things. So that's where we have to go. And I don't know whether you do it in situations like this, because you've got a very elite audience here, I think. I mean, everybody's all dressed up and looking pretty. I don't know. But I don't know how many people from the hood are here who are going to hear this conversation. That is the white hood and the black hood. And the poor white people and the poor black people are in the same boat and don't even realize it. So they've got to have, somehow we got to figure out how to have that conversation too. So anyway, that's my long answer to your question. Sorry.
Two more questions.
No, I don't know. There's a guy up there.
Okay. My name is Reginald Smith, and I'm a student at the School of Social Work here at the University of Texas. You've kind of touched on a lot of the things that I was thinking to ask you, but I'm in
I
class.
do go on, don't I?
Yeah, well, and that's quite all right. And I want to thank you for starting that conversation. I want to thank Dr. Joseph as well for starting this conversation. But as an older black man in class with mainly a lot of young white female social work students, when we start having these conversations about white privilege, you can feel the guilt coming off of them, and I feel bad for them. Can you give me some suggestions or some strategies that I might be able to use to help them to see that you can use your white privilege in order to increase the opportunities for hope that we can make this a more perfect union?
Well, maybe you can talk of it in general terms and not put it on them necessarily. You know, I mean, they may have inherited white privilege, but they didn't have anything to do with how they got there. And so, I mean, sometimes you have to confront it, but other times you can sort of talk around it. And if you want the conversation to go on, rather than to be continually stating your own position, you have to listen to the conversation. Everybody has to listen to the conversation. And so I've had conversations. This brother told me I was at some college in Mississippi. I was on the way, and it was a Gulfport to wherever I was going. And the young brother's father had been a security aide to Martin Luther King when he came to this, I think it was Hattiesburg. And he started telling me about it and so forth. And so he did a lot of the talking as we were going in. But then I said a few things on the way. And so he, unlike a lot of the drivers I have at schools, they'll take me to a place, drop me, and come back and get me when they're supposed to pick me up. And I don't know what it was I said or whether he knew a little bit about my history or the questions I asked him, but he sat in on all of the classes that I spoke to and then the larger assembly later that day. And so on the way back to Gulfport, he begins to tell me things. And he said, you know, I had this white friend. Now, this is a brother who he finished high school, but he didn't go to college. And so he had a white friend who was in the same socioeconomic, and they were friends. I don't know what they both did, because he drives a taxi. His friend, I think, worked in lumber or something. And he said, you know, we used to have such a good time together. We'd go get hamburgers and hot dogs and barbecue and stuff together. And one day they started talking about race. And I guess he had been talking about race. And finally, the white young man said, don't you people ever get over it? Why don't you get over it? And he said, and I just slammed my hand down on the desk and said, what the do you mean get over it? And he said, we went at it. And I said, and then what happened? He said, well, he went his way and I went my way. I said, and then what happened? He said, well, a few days later, we got together again. And he said, I've been thinking about what you said. Because he told him about the history of black oppression in this country and his own oppression and so forth. He said, can we talk about it? So a lot of times it depends upon how you initiate the conversation and how you respond to what people are saying. And as Linda Trop says, you have to get past the difficulties, the difficult part of the conversation, and keep it going. Don't be discouraged by the fact that you don't think people are hearing what you're saying. You know what I'm saying? Know what I'm saying? Think back my work?
My question has to do with the conversation, and it has to do with blacks and whites sitting down talking together, and sometimes whites have some notions about us that we don't want to hear.
Like
that
what?
is hard. Well, oh, yes. I'm Marion Childress Usher, and I'm just a community citizen.
Okay.
Well, it may
You mean
have...
some of the pathology?
Say
They
that
bring up
again.
some of the pathology? Is that what you mean?
Possibly, you know, they might have some real negative feelings about blacks that they would like to express. When we hear it, we can't stand it, and we want to charge back. So, I mean, I realize that the conversation has to be give and take on both sides. So how do we do that?
So you would do that, you're saying. You're giving me an exclamation point. You're not asking me a question.
Well, what I'm asking you is, how do we black people hear negative things that white people might want to say to us without, and understand it, without fighting back?
Well, I think sometimes you have to contextualize. I mean, sometimes, you know, we're not all angels or devils. And part of it is being informed. You know, you need to be informed about your own self. And so when people come at you with something that you can defend, you can do it in a constructive way. I think constructive is the thing. I mean, you can't help but sometimes get angry. I'm gonna tell you a real quick story and how I handled it. I'm a Pisces. I told you my birthday's in a few days. Anybody want to send presents, I'll give you my address. I love presents. I never have a party and say, don't bring presents this time. I say, oh, we bring presents. Anyway, I'm getting my nails done, purple, and there's a white woman in the booth in front of me, or the table, who's not looked around. And she finishes before I do. And she gets up, turns around, sees me, and says, oh, Toni Morrison imitation. Right. Yes. So very quickly, I'm in a place I really like. I don't know who this woman is. My nails are half done. So when she says, oh, Toni Morrison imitation, I say, no. And she then said, well, my mother knows her. Now, every fiber of my being had to continue having my nails polished and not pursue that at that moment, because I didn't think it would be productive. But it was interesting what happened after that. And sometimes you have to keep your mouth closed or answer in one syllable, as I did, although that no carried a few other expletives. I said to the young white girl, I think she was Eastern European because I could hear that in her accent, I said, did you hear what she just said to me? You know what she said? She said, you know, some people have no filters. And I thought that was profound. Now, here's synchronicity in a way. Because here's a white woman who insults me, and here's another white woman who makes it okay. Not okay, but helps me, who's supposed to understand these things, understand it. So sometimes we who have the superior experience or history have to be we have to be teachers, and we have to help people, just like Kevin White, the white sheriff in Montgomery, put in a course in Black history. So when people, this woman, one of the conversations I did was a woman whose cousin was murdered in a drive-by shooting by gangs in South Central LA years ago. And her mother started a series of storefronts to help get young people off the street and get them in a pathway to college, mentoring and so forth and so on. And what's interesting about her is that she herself, her aunt, the boy's mom, passed away in January. So she took over the program. And what's interesting about her is her perspective comes out of her own involvement. She was a member of the Crips, which was a notorious and still remains a notorious gang in South Central LA today. And her boyfriend was a Crip. So I said to her, well, how did you get out of it and where you are today? Because she eventually got out of the Crips, went to college, became a journalist, wrote stories about gangs, then went to theology school, got a theology degree, and now she's running this program. And she said it was my mother. She said, I went from being a straight A student to failing, and at a certain point, my mom just grabbed me. She got my friend, her friend who goes to church. She said, my mom didn't go to church, but her friend went to church. And she said, take my daughter to church. And then there was some local thing where she could earn a few dollars, working, and she monitored that. And that's what got her out of the gang. So she then went on to that success. So she's mentoring several hundred students, and they've got Georgia Tech and UGA banners on the wall, and Harvard, and all of these colleges and universities that they're trying to get these kids programmed out of gangs and out of the street life, because there's nothing in South Central. There's not a single industry other than the drug industry. So I said to her, so do you think that this can be replicated around the country? And she said, well, I don't know. People have to do what they can do in their own communities, in their own way. But there are lessons in what she's doing. I think she was just being, modest. But she is doing an amazing job with those kids. And I think that it has potential around the country, because, the other thing that doesn't happen is that we aren't told the good things that are happening. I listened to the news this morning, and my horoscope, and I read my horoscope every day, my horoscope said, don't get distracted. You've got something major to do today. It really did. Now, that's synchronicity for you, right? But I'm listening also to CNN, and I was furious because they are fomenting trouble that doesn't exist, and creating things that in the normal course of things would be taken care of by the people involved. But they are pushing it because it pushes the ratings of their news organizations. And so they are fomenting a lot. Now, there's a lot out there. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot that's funny out there, and I don't mean in a ha-ha way. But they are killing Rubio right now, for example, because he said Barack Obama was doing what he meant to do, or doing something good. I forget exactly what the phrase was. Some of you might remember, but I think he said, I forget exactly what it is now. Now, he has subsequently changed it around a little bit to make it a little bit more positive, because he was critically attacked by Chris Christie. Barack Obama is doing what he intended to do for the country, or something like that. And then he turns it around to say, and he wants to change the country. But instead of having a constructive argument about it, they're just zeroing in on the negative aspect, because that's what the people are feeding off of, and that's what they want them to do. So I'm saying, wait a minute, what is our responsibility in this? And I'm going to finish with this. A young friend of mine at a panel I did in New York the other day with Khalil got up and complained about some commercial where football players were dressed in women's clothes or something. I didn't see it, but they were dressed as women and had, I don't know what even the point was, because she just went off, so she couldn't really totally explain it. But Cam Newton's name was running under it, and so forth, and so she saw it as a diss against him. And so I said to her, okay, that could be racist, but what did you do about it? Did you call the network? Did you sit down and write a letter and say, this is unacceptable? I find this objectionable, and these are the reasons why. And I will speak to all of my black friends and my white friends who are conscious, and have them write in. How many of you have ever been upset by something you've seen on television or read in a newspaper and complained to your husband or wife or partner or neighbor and let it go at that? You can't change, what is it DeRay says? You can't change it without, it's a beautiful, you can't change it without addressing it. So we got to be, we who are in privileged positions, as I'm sure all of you in this room are, have got to exert ourselves, not just at the ballot box, but in places that will make a difference to the perceptions of other people. There are all kinds of things we can do, but we can't sit unless we sit like Rosa Parks sat and expect things to change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.